Charlie Chaplin made the entire world laugh for over 50 years. But off-screen, the women who married him lived through a very different story, one Hollywood spent decades trying to keep quiet. 4 marriages, 4 wildly different women, and a pattern running through nearly all of them that still makes people uncomfortable today. One marriage nearly ended his career. Another might be the only truly happy chapter in his entire life. Stick around, because this story is far more complicated than the comedy legend ever let on. The man behind the tramp. Before the fame, before the fortune, and before any of his 4 marriages, Charlie Chaplin was simply a poor boy from South London, trying to survive a childhood that offered him almost nothing. He was born on April 16th, 1889, into a family of struggling music hall performers, and his early years were marked by genuine hardship, including stretches spent in workhouses and a mother whose mental health deteriorated so severely that she was eventually institutionalized. That kind of instability, poverty, neglect, and uncertainty shaped Chaplin profoundly, and biographers have long pointed to those formative years as the foundation for both his artistic genius and the deeply complicated personal life that would follow him for the rest of his days. His father, also a performer, struggled with alcoholism and largely disappeared from Charlie's life while he was still a young child, leaving his mother, Hannah, to raise Charlie and his older half-brother Sidney largely on her own in extreme poverty. There were periods during his childhood when the family had nowhere stable to live at all, and young Charlie occasionally found himself performing on stage simply to help keep the family fed, an experience that gave him an early, hard-won understanding of exactly how thin the line could be between comfort and complete destitution, a lesson that seemed to stay with him throughout even his most successful years. Chaplin himself later wrote candidly about these years in his own memoirs, describing the shame and fear that came with watching his mother's condition deteriorate and being separated from her for extended stretches while she received treatment. Experiences that left him, by his own admission, deeply guarded and self-protective for the rest of his life, even amid extraordinary wealth and fame. Those closest to him in later decades often remarked that no amount of success ever seemed to fully erase the anxiety and insecurity that had taken root during those earliest, hardest years of his childhood. By his early 20s, Chaplin had made his way into vaudeville and eventually crossed the Atlantic with a touring comedy troupe, catching the attention of American film studios during the earliest years of the movie industry. He developed his now iconic character, the Little Tramp, a shabby but endlessly resourceful figure who became an instant sensation with audiences around the world, recognizable almost immediately by his oversized shoes, tight coat, and battered bowler hat. Within just a few years, Chaplin had become one of the most famous and highest-paid entertainers on the planet, eventually co-founding the United Artists Film Studio alongside fellow icons Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith, a level of fame and creative control that gave him extraordinary power and access within an industry that offered him very little accountability for how he used it. By his late 20s, he was earning a salary that dwarfed nearly anyone else in the entertainment business, commanding audiences across continents, despite working entirely in a medium with no spoken dialogue at all, a testament to just how universally his particular brand of physical comedy translated across cultures and languages. It was against this backdrop of overwhelming fame and almost total personal freedom that Chaplin began the first of 4 marriages, relationships that, when examined closely, reveal a deeply troubling pattern that Hollywood at the time largely chose to overlook. A marriage built on a rumor. In 1918, at the height of his growing fame, 29-year-old Chaplin met a 16-year-old actress named Mildred Harris at a party in Los Angeles. Harris had already been working in films for several years by that point, having started in the industry as a child performer, and the two began a relationship that, by most accounts, moved quickly once Chaplin took an interest in her. He reportedly pursued her with considerable persistence, sending flowers and waiting outside her studio after her workdays ended, a level of attention that Harris, still a teenager navigating an already demanding career, found flattering given his enormous fame and status within the industry. Not long into their courtship, Harris told Chaplin she believed she was pregnant, and rather than risk the kind of public scandal such news could bring, Chaplin married her privately on October 23, 1918, in Los Angeles. It later turned out that the initial pregnancy scare had, in fact, been a false alarm. Despite this shaky beginning, the marriage continued, and Harris did become genuinely pregnant not long afterward. On July 7th, 1919, the couple welcomed a son, whom they named Norman Spencer Chaplin. The baby was born with serious physical complications, and tragically, he lived for only 3 days before passing away. Harris affectionately nicknamed him the Little Mouse, a name that remains engraved on his small gravestone in Inglewood, California, to this day. Those close to Chaplin at the time later said that the loss affected him deeply, with one friend later recalling that Chaplin grew visibly emotional discussing funeral arrangements for the infant, and many biographers believe this devastating personal tragedy became part of the emotional inspiration behind his acclaimed 1921 film, The Kid, which centers on a father's bond with an abandoned child, and which he began writing and filming only a few weeks after his son's death. The marriage itself, however, was already struggling before the loss of their son, and it continued to unravel in the months that followed. Chaplin and Harris had little in common intellectually or personally, and disagreements over her acting career and contract with studio executive Louis B. Mayer only widened the growing distance between them. Chaplin reportedly felt that Harris did not share his intellectual interests or his growing seriousness about the artistic possibilities of filmmaking, a mismatch that left both of them increasingly isolated within their own marriage. Harris herself later reflected that the only thing she could truly recall of their brief time together was how deeply Chaplin had cried when their infant son died, suggesting that whatever genuine emotional connection existed between them may have been buried beneath the sheer weight of circumstance and mismatched expectations from the very beginning of their union. The couple separated in the fall of 1919 and officially divorced in November of 1920, with Harris receiving a settlement reported at roughly $100,000, a substantial sum for the era. It was, by comparison to what would come next, a relatively contained and quiet ending, with Chaplin reportedly harboring far less bitterness toward Harris than he would toward his next wife, largely because Harris made no attempt to publicly damage his reputation during or after their separation. She went on to continue working steadily in Hollywood for another 2 decades, appearing in dozens of films before her own career gradually faded, and she died in 1944 at just 42 years old, having largely moved on from the marriage that had briefly made her one of the most talked about young women in America. But the pattern that had defined Chaplin's first marriage, a very young actress, a rushed decision driven by circumstance rather than genuine partnership, was about to repeat itself in a far more damaging and public way. The child actress who became his second wife. Years before she ever became his wife, a young girl named Lilita McMurray, known professionally as Lita Gray, had already crossed paths with Chaplin as a child performer. Accounts suggest Chaplin first became acquainted with her family when she was as young as 8 years old, and she appeared in small roles in his films The Kid and The Idol Class, while still just a preteen, working alongside a man roughly 3 decades her senior in an industry that offered almost no protections or boundaries for its youngest performers. Gray's own mother, worked periodically within the film industry as well, and the family's proximity to Chaplin's professional circle over the years meant that the relationship between Chaplin and the young Lita developed gradually over the course of nearly a decade, rather than emerging suddenly out of nowhere. As she grew into her teenage years, that professional connection evolved into something far more troubling, and by the time she was 15, Chaplin cast her as the leading lady in what would become one of his most celebrated films, The Gold Rush, a decision that placed a teenage girl at the center of one of the most anticipated productions of Chaplin's entire career. During filming, when Lita was 16 years old and Chaplin was 35, she became pregnant. Under California law at the time, the circumstances of that pregnancy meant Chaplin faced the very real possibility of being charged with a serious crime involving sexual contact with a minor, an offense that carried significant legal consequences regardless of his fame or wealth. According to accounts Lita gave decades later, her mother confronted Chaplin directly, making clear that unless he agreed to marry her daughter, the matter would be reported to the authorities. Chaplin reportedly explored the possibility of ending the pregnancy instead, an option Lita and her family firmly refused. To avoid prosecution, Chaplin arranged a quiet, hastily organized wedding across the border in Mexico on November 26, 1924, with reports later suggesting that the timeline surrounding the ceremony and the birth of their first child was deliberately obscured, including allegations that a doctor was paid to adjust official paperwork to make the circumstances appear less alarming than they actually were. The couple went on to have two sons together, Charles Spencer Chaplin Jr., born in 1925, and Sidney Earl Chaplin, born in 1926. From nearly the beginning, the marriage was unhappy and deeply strained. Chaplin, by most accounts, spent as much time away from home as possible, immersing himself in his work on the gold rush and later the circus, while Lita found herself isolated and increasingly unhappy within a marriage she had never truly chosen for herself. The couple had little in common, still separated by both age and life experience, in ways that made any genuine partnership almost impossible. And reports from those close to the family described a household marked by tension, distance, and growing resentment on both sides as the years went on. Lita later recalled feeling trapped within her own home, a teenage mother of two young children living under the roof of one of the most famous and powerful men in the world, with very little say over her own daily life. She would later write that Chaplin reportedly told her early in their marriage that it wouldn't last long, a comment she found chilling to look back on, given everything that eventually followed. Friends of the couple at the time described Chaplin as almost entirely absent from the day-to-day realities of family life, leaving Lita to manage a household and raise two infant sons, largely without meaningful support or companionship from her famous husband. The divorce that shook Hollywood. In January of 1927, after less than 3 years of marriage, Lita Gray filed for divorce, and the resulting legal battle became one of the most sensational scandals in early Hollywood history. Her divorce complaint ran dozens of pages and included allegations of cruelty, neglect, infidelity, and behavior that, if made public in full, threatened to destroy Chaplin's career entirely. The complaint detailed disturbing claims about the earliest days of their relationship, when she was still well below the legal age of consent, along with accusations of pressure to end an earlier pregnancy and demands within the marriage that she described as deeply degrading. The document also alleged that Chaplin had engaged in numerous affairs with other prominent women throughout their brief marriage, further painting a picture of a household defined by betrayal and instability. The scandal exploded across newspapers nationwide, and there were public calls in some circles for Chaplin's films to be boycotted or banned altogether, with women's groups and religious organizations in several states voicing outrage over the details that had become public. Chaplin reportedly suffered what those around him described as a nervous breakdown amid the pressure, and production on his film The Circus was forced to halt for months while the legal battle played out. An extraordinary disruption for a filmmaker known for his meticulous, hands-on approach to every stage of production. Court receivers went so far as to freeze Chaplin's entire estate, then valued at roughly $16 million. While the case proceeded, a dramatic and very public demonstration of just how seriously the courts were treating Lita's claims. When the divorce was finally finalized in August of 1927, Chaplin was ordered to pay a settlement of $825,000, split between a direct payment to Lita of roughly $625,000 and an additional $200,000 placed in trust for their two young sons, an amount that stood as the largest divorce settlement in California history at the time. The judge overseeing the case ordered that the most sensational portions of the complaint be sealed from public record, though copies had already circulated widely enough that the broader public was well aware of the general nature of the allegations against him. Despite the scale of the scandal, Chaplin's career ultimately survived largely intact, a testament to just how much protection his enormous fame and box office success afforded him during an era with far fewer mechanisms for public accountability than exist today. The Circus was eventually completed and released to strong reviews in January of 1928, and Chaplin even received a special honorary award at the very first Academy Awards ceremony for his versatility in acting, writing, directing, and producing the film, a striking contrast to the personal turmoil that had nearly derailed the production entirely. By most accounts, Chaplin himself rarely spoke about this period of his life again in any detail, treating both the marriage and the scandal that ended it as a chapter he preferred to leave firmly in the past rather than revisit publicly. Even decades later, when journalists and biographers repeatedly pressed him for his own perspective on what had happened. Lita Gray, meanwhile, found her own career opportunities significantly diminished in the years that followed, her name forever tied to a scandal that overshadowed her own considerable talent and ambitions. She would go on to marry 3 more times over the following decades before her death in 1995, but she remained, for the rest of her life, most widely remembered as the teenage bride whose marriage nearly brought down one of the most famous men in the world. A different kind of marriage. After the devastating fallout from his second marriage, Chaplin's next serious relationship took a notably different shape. In the mid-1930s, he grew close to actress Paulette Goddard, a woman closer to him in both age and life experience than either of his previous wives had been. The two reportedly married sometime around 1936, possibly aboard Chaplin's yacht during a voyage to the Far East, though the exact details and timing of the ceremony remained deliberately vague and were never fully confirmed publicly, likely a reflection of just how much scrutiny Chaplin's previous marriages had already brought upon his personal life. When journalists and government investigators later pressed him for details, Chaplin largely declined to comment, and it later emerged during an unrelated federal investigation that questions were even raised about whether Chaplin, born in London and never a naturalized American citizen despite decades living in the United States, had followed proper legal procedures at all, a level of secrecy that stood in sharp contrast to the very public spectacle that had surrounded his second marriage just a decade earlier. Goddard starred alongside Chaplin in 2 of his most celebrated films, Modern Times in 1936 and The Great Dictator in 1940, and by most accounts, their partnership carried a far more genuine sense of mutual respect and professional collaboration than either of his prior marriages had. Goddard was already an established and talented actress in her own right, someone widely considered for major roles across Hollywood, including an early candidacy for the lead in Gone with the Wind before losing out to Vivian Leigh. And she continued building an independent and successful career throughout their years together, appearing opposite major stars like Gary Cooper and Bob Hope in a range of popular films. That independence and professional standing gave their relationship a different dynamic entirely, one built more on partnership than the deeply uneven power imbalances that had defined his earlier marriages. Even so, the relationship eventually began to strain, particularly following the completion of The Great Dictator, a politically charged satire of European fascism that placed considerable pressure on both Chaplin's career and his personal relationships during an especially tense period, with the film generating significant controversy both for its content and for the physical and emotional demands its production placed on everyone involved. The couple divorced in June of 1942 after roughly 6 years together, reportedly due to a combination of ongoing disagreements and rumors of infidelity on both sides. Unlike his previous, deeply acrimonious split from Lita Gray, this divorce was handled with considerably more discretion and mutual respect, and the two reportedly remained on cordial terms for the rest of their lives, with Goddard going on to continue her successful acting career for decades afterward, eventually marrying twice more, including to novelist Erich Maria Remarque, before her own death in 1990 from complications related to emphysema. It was, by most measures, the most balanced and mature of Chaplin's marriages up to that point, a relationship that suggested, briefly, that Chaplin was capable of a genuinely equal partnership when the circumstances allowed for one. But almost immediately after this divorce, Chaplin found himself drawn once again toward a woman decades younger than himself, setting the stage for both the most controversial and, ultimately, the most enduring relationship of his entire life. The teenager who became his soulmate. In late 1942, shortly after his divorce from Goddard, Chaplin was introduced to a 17-year-old aspiring actress named Una O'Neill, the daughter of the celebrated American playwright Eugene O'Neill, a Nobel Prize winner widely regarded as one of the greatest dramatists of the 20th century. Una had grown up largely apart from her famous father, raised primarily by her mother in New Jersey and New York after her parents' early divorce, and she attended the prestigious Brearley School in Manhattan, where she was voted the most glamorous debutante of her graduating class. She had come to Hollywood hoping to launch an acting career, and Chaplin briefly considered her for a role in an unmade film project titled Shadow and Substance. Though that particular role never materialized, largely because Chaplin felt she was too inexperienced for the part, the two quickly grew close, spending increasing amounts of time together as he began personally coaching her in acting and speech. Despite the more than 3-decade age gap between them, 53-year-old Chaplin and 18-year-old Una married in Santa Barbara, California, on June 16, 1943, just 1 month after her 18th birthday, a timing that many observers at the time noted seemed deliberately calculated to avoid the same legal complications that had defined his marriage to Lita Gray nearly 2 decades earlier. Their wedding took place quietly, away from the press, with only a small number of witnesses present, a stark contrast to the media circus that had surrounded so much of Chaplin's previous romantic history. The marriage sparked immediate and widespread controversy. Given Chaplin's already well-known history of relationships with much younger women, many in the press and public reacted with open suspicion and disapproval, and gossip columnists across the country openly speculated about how long this fourth marriage might realistically last, given the pattern that had defined nearly every relationship in Chaplin's adult life up to that point. Several newspapers ran editorials questioning why a man in his 50s would repeatedly seek out partners barely out of adolescence, drawing direct comparisons to his marriages to both Mildred Harris and Lita Gray decades earlier, and suggesting that this fourth marriage represented simply the latest chapter in a lifelong pattern, rather than any kind of genuine change in his character or judgment. Perhaps most painfully for Una, her own father was among those most furious about the union. Eugene O'Neill, who was roughly the same age as Chaplin himself, was reportedly outraged by the marriage and cut off nearly all contact with his daughter afterward, a rift that, by most accounts, was never meaningfully repaired before his own death in 1953. Some biographers have suggested that O'Neill's anger stemmed at least partly from his own complicated history of having largely abandoned Una as a young child, making his fury over her marriage feel, to some who knew the family, like a strange and painful form of projection. A father who had once left his own daughter, now suddenly positioning himself as her fierce protector against a much older man. Despite the controversy surrounding its beginning, and despite widespread predictions that the marriage would quickly collapse, just as his previous relationships had, Una and Chaplin's partnership proved to be remarkably enduring. Those close to the couple described a genuine and deep devotion between them that seemed to defy nearly every expectation surrounding their unusual pairing. Una set aside her own acting ambitions almost entirely, choosing instead to focus on building a family and a stable home life alongside a man whose previous marriages had all ended in scandal, heartbreak, or both. Loyalty through exile and scandal. The timing of Chaplin's marriage to Una coincided almost exactly with another major scandal in his life, an unrelated and highly publicized paternity lawsuit filed against him by a young actress named Joan Barry just weeks before his wedding. Barry had briefly been involved with Chaplin during the period before he met Una, and when she gave birth to a daughter in 1943, she publicly named Chaplin as the father, triggering a sensational and widely covered legal battle that unfolded in the press alongside coverage of his brand new marriage. Though a blood test later indicated Chaplin was very unlikely to be the biological father, the court at the time did not permit such evidence to be considered decisive, and Chaplin was ultimately ordered to pay child support regardless, a legal outcome that struck many observers, then and now, as a significant miscarriage of justice given the available scientific evidence. The case dragged on publicly for months, generating headlines that painted an unflattering picture of Chaplin's personal conduct at almost the exact moment he was beginning his marriage to a woman barely out of her teens. It was, in many ways, a fitting and difficult beginning to a marriage that would spend its earliest years surrounded by public scrutiny and controversy that had little to do with Una herself. As Chaplin and Una built their family together throughout the following years, welcoming several children in quick succession, including their eldest daughter Geraldine in 1944 and son Michael in 1946, an even larger crisis was quietly building in the background. Chaplin's political views, which leaned toward left-wing causes and included public support for various progressive organizations during the tense early years of the Cold War, along with his refusal to formally become an American citizen despite decades of living and working in the United States, had drawn increasing suspicion from government officials during the tense political climate of the post-war years. FBI files later revealed that Chaplin had been under surveillance for years, with investigators searching for any justification to remove him from the country entirely. In September of 1952, while Chaplin was traveling abroad in London for the premiere of his film Limelight, the United States government revoked his re-entry permit, effectively barring him from returning to the country where he had built his entire career, citing concerns over his political associations and alleged moral behavior. It was an extraordinary and unprecedented action against a man who had spent nearly 4 decades as one of America's most beloved entertainers, and it sent shockwaves through the film industry. Though Chaplin's often difficult relationship with the American press and public in his later years meant that reaction to the decision was notably more divided than it might have been a decade or two earlier. Some prominent voices in Hollywood publicly defended him, while others, still carrying resentment from his earlier scandals and his outspoken political views, welcomed the government's decision as long overdue. The financial and logistical toll of the sudden exile fell heavily on the entire family, requiring them to essentially abandon the life they had built in Beverly Hills over the preceding decade and start over entirely in an unfamiliar country, all while managing four young children and the ongoing pressure of intense international media coverage surrounding their situation. Rather than fight the decision or return alone to face what would likely have been a hostile and highly public legal battle, Chaplin chose exile, and Una stood by him completely. She reportedly helped transfer significant portions of the family's financial assets out of the United States herself, famously sewing bank documents into the lining of her coat during the journey to ensure the family's security as they relocated permanently to Switzerland. It was a remarkable act of practical loyalty from a woman still only in her late 20s at the time, managing the logistics of an international relocation for a family that, by that point, already included four young children. In 1954, she made the extraordinary decision to formally renounce her own United States citizenship entirely, aligning her legal identity completely with her husband's rather than maintaining any separation between them, a gesture that spoke volumes about the depth of her loyalty during one of the most difficult chapters of Chaplin's life. 34 years, and a grief that followed. Settled permanently in Switzerland, Chaplin and Una went on to raise 8 children together, building a large, stable family life on their sprawling estate, known as the Manoir de Bonn, in the village of Coursier-sur-Vevey, a stark contrast to the chaos and scandal that had defined so much of Chaplin's earlier personal history. Their children arrived steadily throughout the following decade: Geraldine in 1944, Michael in 1946, Josephine in 1949, and Victoria in 1951 during their final years in America, followed by Eugene in 1953, Jane in 1957, Annette in 1959, and finally Christopher in 1962, after the family had fully settled into their new life in Switzerland. Several of their children went on to pursue careers of their own within the entertainment industry, including their eldest daughter, Geraldine Chaplin, who became a respected actress in her own right, eventually portraying her own mother's fierce loyalty and complicated marriage in a major 1992 biographical film about her father's life, a project that brought the family's story full circle in a particularly poignant way. Those who visited the Chaplin household during these years often described Una as a warm, grounded, and remarkably stable presence at the center of an otherwise unconventional family, someone who managed the practical realities of raising 8 children on a large estate, while also protecting her husband's increasingly fragile creative reputation as his film career slowed considerably following their move to Europe. Chaplin himself continued working sporadically throughout these years, though never again reaching the extraordinary heights of fame and productivity that had defined his earlier decades in Hollywood. And by most accounts, Una's steady presence gave him a sense of security and purpose that had been entirely absent throughout his 3 previous marriages. Una and Chaplin remained married for 34 years, right up until his death on December 25th, 1977, at their Swiss home, at the age of 88. He died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family, on Christmas morning, bringing to a close one of the longest and most unlikely careers in the history of cinema, a journey that had carried him from workhouses in South London to becoming one of the most recognized faces on the entire planet. In a strange and widely reported postscript to his death, Chaplin's body was actually stolen from its grave just months later, in March of 1978, by 2 men attempting to extort money from the family. though the coffin was eventually recovered undamaged after an 11-week search and reburied under significantly increased security, encased in concrete to prevent any future attempt at disturbing his final resting place. Of all his marriages, it was, by every available account, the one relationship that finally offered Chaplin something resembling genuine, lasting partnership, built on Una's remarkable and unwavering devotion through decades of political upheaval, public scrutiny, and the ordinary challenges of raising 8 children together in exile from the country where he had built his entire career and reputation. For Una, however, the years following Chaplin's death proved to be genuinely difficult. Those close to the family have described her struggling considerably with grief in the years after losing him, and by some accounts, she battled periods of heavy alcohol use as she attempted to navigate life without the partner who had defined so much of her adult identity since she was barely out of her teens. Having devoted virtually her entire adult life to supporting her husband's career and reputation, Una found herself, in her 50s, facing the difficult task of building an identity separate from the marriage that had consumed nearly her entire adulthood, a challenge that friends said she never fully resolved in the years that remained to her. She divided her remaining years between the family's longtime estate in Switzerland and periods spent in New York City, where she had grown up decades earlier before her life had taken such an extraordinary and unexpected turn, gradually rebuilding pieces of her own independent identity, even as she continued serving as the primary guardian of Chaplin's legacy and reputation, fielding requests from biographers, filmmakers, and journalists eager to understand the man behind one of cinema's most complicated legacies. On September 27th, 1991, Una died from pancreatic cancer at the family home in Switzerland at the age of 66, closing out the final chapter of the marriage that had once scandalized America and ultimately outlasted every prediction made against it. 4 wives, one troubling pattern. Looking back across all 4 of Charlie Chaplin's marriages, a pattern emerges that modern audiences find increasingly difficult to reconcile with his beloved comedic legacy. 3 of his 4 wives were still teenagers when he married them, relationships built on power imbalances that, particularly in the case of Lita Gray, edged into territory that would have carried serious legal consequences under the laws of the time. Consequences Chaplin largely managed to avoid through wealth, fame, and hastily arranged marriages designed specifically to prevent scandal and prosecution. Mildred Harris and Lita Gray both endured marriages built on circumstance rather than genuine partnership, unions that left lasting scars on both women, even as Chaplin's own career and reputation largely recovered within just a few years of each scandal. Lita Gray herself would later reflect openly on this troubling pattern in interviews given decades after their marriage had ended, suggesting that Chaplin seemed to be drawn specifically to very young women precisely because of the power that age gap afforded him within each relationship. Telling one interviewer late in her life that Chaplin appeared to enjoy the experience of shaping and moulding a much younger partner's entire worldview, effectively becoming the first significant figure of authority and romantic attachment in each young woman's adult life. It's an observation that, decades later, feels uncomfortably consistent with everything else known about the pattern running through his first 3 marriages, and one that biographers and historians examining Chaplin's life have increasingly taken seriously, rather than dismissing as simply the bitter recollection of an ex-wife looking to settle old scores. Paulette Goddard's marriage stood apart as a more genuinely equal partnership, though it too eventually ended in separation after years of strain, offering perhaps the clearest example of what a more balanced relationship with Chaplin might have looked like when the substantial power imbalance present in his other marriages was significantly reduced. And Una O'Neill, despite beginning her relationship with Chaplin as a teenager herself, found in that unlikely and controversial union something that none of his previous wives ever fully experienced: 3.5 decades of steady, mutual devotion, even through exile, scandal, and the ordinary difficulties of raising a large family together. Though even her story carries an undercurrent of a young woman who gave up her own identity and ambitions almost entirely in service of her much older husband's career and reputation. Decades later, as audiences continue to celebrate Chaplin's extraordinary contributions to filmmaking and comedy, the fuller story of the women who shared his personal life offers a far more complicated and, in some cases, deeply troubling picture of the man behind the beloved Little Tramp. Their stories, largely overshadowed for decades by his cinematic legacy, deserve to be remembered not simply as footnotes in Chaplin's biography, but as the full, complex, and often painful chapters they truly were, each one revealing something essential about power, fame, and the very different ways four women navigated a life spent in the shadow of one of the 20th century's most complicated and controversial legends. Their combined stories offer a far more honest reckoning with Chaplin's legacy than his films alone could ever provide. A reminder that even the most beloved and celebrated cultural figures can carry personal histories that deserve to be examined with the same scrutiny and honesty that later generations have increasingly demanded. Four women, four very different endings, and one towering legacy that, even a century later, still can't be fully separated from the questions their stories continue to raise. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.